Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Balie. I'm very glad you're all here tonight. My name is Iante Mosselman. I'm a program editor here at the Balie. And I am very honored to be interviewing my two guests tonight. German bestseller author Bernhard Schlink. Very warm welcome. Very glad you are here tonight. And Nikki Sterkenburg, researcher, former researcher and reporter on far extremists in the Netherlands. And this evening is a cooperation with uitgeverij Cossé. And what we'll do tonight is there will be some fragments of the music is still on. It gives it a bit of a...
It's very dramatic.
Heavyweight. There will be a few fragments read, and we'll have a conversation about this beautiful, beautiful book, The Granddaughter, The Kleindochter. It's also really beautifully translated, so I'm very much looking forward to that. We're not going to have a really long evening because you're not feeling super well, and that's also why Christoph Buchwald will read to us, and he will read in German. But if your German is not so good, don't worry, we have the Dutch translation on screen, so you can get the best of both languages. So before I start, I'm going to introduce you a bit more properly. Bernhard Schlink is Emeritus Professor in Law at the Humboldt University, writer of many novels, stories and essays. And in I'm always really bad with numbers. 1995, the novel The Reader capitulated him into international literary fame. And tonight we're speaking about like I said, the Dutch translation of this beautiful book. And we invited him to reflect on the limits of tolerance and understanding. And it's a subject that's really present in this book. And we're also speaking with Nikki Sterkenburg. And we're speaking with her about the image of right-wing extremism in Germany and the Netherlands today. And the role together we will discuss the role of fiction and journalism. Please give them a warm welcome, a warm applause. So before we start with a small fragment of the book, I wanted to ask you, when you started writing this book, the history and the recent history always plays an important role in your work. When do you remember the exact moment when you first thought, I want to write about extreme right in Germany?
Well, it began not with the part that deals with the extreme right, but the other part that deals with the East and West. And I, as Casper, the protagonist, was in East Berlin in 1964. And I had a girlfriend whom I brought from East to West. And we weren't lovers for long, but we always were friends. And she died 3 years ago. Ah. And that brought this past back to me. So the first step was getting into this. And since I have always followed what's happening in the East, while Germany was still divided, I read East German literature as I read West German literature. I also always believed in reunification, when hardly anybody did. And so I also followed what was happening after reunification, particularly since I became professor at Humboldt in 1990. So I was there during the last year of the GDR. Yeah. And following what happened in the GDR, in the former GDR, of course I came across the right-wing movement in its different facets.
And did you, as a student, also you went to East Berlin, and if you draw also from your memory, did you remember many things, or did you have a way to activate your own memory?
Oh, I remembered many things. It was a very intense period. I came from Heidelberg, where I grew up. I wanted to go and study at Freie University to come to know kind of the whole Germany, as far as one could, going to East Berlin. And then I had many friends there. And after the wall had been built, many in the GDR hoped that now there would come a time of liberation.
Yeah.
Because they don't have to be afraid that people will run away. So they can give more freedom. And all these debates, where shall we move? Is this a last or another chance or a chance to build a better socialist country? All of that was very intense.
Yeah. Casper, out of love, considers moving to the East. Did you ever consider it?
Maybe for 5 minutes.
But never really.
Not really, no.
Thank you. We're going to discuss.
I mean, I didn't mind that it was poor. And in 1964, the difference between East and West Berlin wasn't that big.
Oh.
West Berlin was still much destroyed, grey, like East Berlin. But I learned from all my friends what they couldn't do and couldn't say and couldn't become, couldn't make out of their lives. No, there was no temptation.
I want to ask one more thing right now. Was there something you forgot about that period that you remembered when you were writing this book?
Oh, it was. I mean, what I didn't have on my screen was the atmosphere. And writing about it brought the atmosphere back.
Thank you. Yes. Nikki, I want to ask you something as well. Because you published both a book and you did your PhD on right-wing extremism in the Netherlands.
Yes.
Why?
Because I really wanted to know the group and the individuals in it itself. It started all out when I went to a demonstration and I got in touch with 3 neo-Nazis who didn't dress as the typical neo-Nazi, that they were very well-spoken, well-behaved, dressed very well, and they said, well, we're just putting ourselves out there in a more moderate way so we can get the message across. And I thought, okay, this is really interesting. I want to know more about this, and that's how it all started.
And they looked like students.
Yes, your average barista in your coffee shop, and students and hipsters, and that's how it all started. And then it kind of evolved because I went for 3 years. I kind of went embedded with the far-right extremist movement, and I think I interviewed more than 45 persons, and most of them also for a longer period of time as well.
Thank you. I think we're going to go to the first fragment. I'm going to introduce it very briefly. Let me just read this. The granddaughter Sigun shows up only in the second half of your book. And the first part is about Casper and more specifically his wife Birgit, who grew up in Eastern Germany and fled to the West. And after she dies, Casper finds a manuscript she never shared with him. And the bit we're going to read, or Christoph is going to read, is from that part. Thank you.
Mir passierte im Kleinen, was ich den Ostdeutschen nach der Wende im Großen passieren sah. Zunächst wurden sie beglückt willkommen geheißen. Sie wurden auch interessiert gefragt, wie es im Osten zugegangen war, wie sie im Osten gelebt hatten. Aber sie wurden gefragt, wie man jemanden nach einer Reise fragt, die er gemacht hat. Als sich zeigte, dass sie nicht nur eine Reise gemacht hatten und jetzt wieder da waren, sondern aus einer anderen Welt kamen, einer Welt, in der ihnen manches nicht gepasst hatte, die aber ihre war, die sie aufgebaut und erhalten hatten, der sie verbunden waren und blieben, war es mit dem Interesse vorbei. Im Osten war etwas Eigenes entstanden. Im Osten hatte es Unterdrückung, Unrecht und Unglück gegeben. Unterdrückung und Unrecht waren vorbei. Die unterdrückten Ostdeutschen konnten wieder sein wie die nicht unterdrückten Westdeutschen und hatten keinen Grund mehr, anders zu sein. Wenn sie es doch waren, war es ungehörig und überdies undankbar, weil sie reich beschenkt worden waren, um so glücklich zu sein wie die glücklichen Westdeutschen. Wir Ostdeutschen lassen, wenn wir unter Westdeutschen sind, am besten alles Östliche hinter uns. Das gilt damals wie heute. Ich habe die DDR nicht nur wegen meiner Tochter zum weißen Fleck zur Terra Incognita gemacht. Es hat mir auch das Studium verleidet. Ich gehörte nicht dazu. In den Vorlesungen ging's, wir saßen alle stumm da und hörten zu und schrieben mit. Aber in den Seminaren und Kolloquien gab es die Studenten, die alles und noch mehr gelesen hatten und die richtigen Fragen stellten und die richtigen Antworten gaben und scharfsinnige, kritische Bemerkungen machten. Sie waren nicht nur klug oder, wenn sie es nicht waren, taten nicht nur klug, sondern waren geschmeidig, gewandt und beredt und gerade so arrogant, dass wir anderen es als Ausdruck wirklicher Überlegenheit akzeptierten. Wir anderen, ich war nicht die Einzige, die schwieg. Ich senkte nicht als Einzige den Kopf, wenn der Professor in die Runde fragte. Ich stotterte nicht als Einzige, wenn ich reden musste. Aber bei den anderen war es Schüchternheit. Ich fürchtete, etwas zu sagen, woran meine Herkunft aus dem Osten erkennbar wäre und worauf der Professor mit unsere Kommilitonin aus dem Osten oder was meint denn Karl Marx dazu? Sie wissen das sicher. Oder das lernt man hier auf dem Gymnasium, aber das gibt's bei Ihnen nicht, reagieren würde. Oder dass einer von den Geschmeidigen meine Herkunft exotisch finden, mich nach der Stunde ansprechen und ich mich nur unterlegen, nur entsetzlich fühlen würde.
Thank you very much, Christoph. It's a beautiful and also very gripping fragment of otherness, to leave everything Eastern behind. And you write, this was now and then. Do you think, is it still like that, do you think?
That was one of the big problems after reunification. The West Germans expected the East Germans, now without the SED dictatorship, be like them. And then when they realized they weren't, at first they were surprised and then upset, and then they found it impertinent. So East Germans who came to the West were better off not telling where they came from, just trying to melt in. And those who stayed in the East started to develop their resentment vis-à-vis the West. And there were even more primitive forms of West Germans. They knew everything, not just about literature, about taxis and cars and streets and industries, just everything. And that's how they look down on the East Germans. And the East Germans, they should be grateful for all we give them, but they aren't. They're resentful. So I remember very well, I arrived teaching at Humboldt University in January, so it was not even 2 months after the wall had come down. At first it was a spring of love. West Germans greeted the East Germans. East Germans were happy to be happily greeted. And this spring of love lasted maybe 2 months. And then this other dynamics started to come into play.
But that story of love of the 2 months has remained, I think, very dominant in the narrative that we in the Netherlands, for instance, have about the unification.
Oh, I think there's no doubt that the two Germanys belong together. And I don't know any East German who wants the GDR back. So we know that this is now what we are and who we are. And all we can do is grow together. That takes time. And I'm not pessimistic. Just look at the United States after the War of Secession. Compared to that, we are in excellent shape growing together.
And this Eastern Europe, this Eastern German narrative is very important, I think, in the story to understand where Sigrun comes from. Can you do the story about the unification and Eastern Germany is very important, I think, in the book to understand what is happening in the family of Sigrun and the granddaughter and how she grows up. Can you tell me a bit about it? Why is it so essential to why is this resentment, do you reckon, so how does it lead, do you think, to the village? Because they've really created a sort of village that is has a completely own right extreme narrative. It's almost apart.
That East Germans are more right-wing than West Germans has many reasons. One simple reason is in East Germany, it was not a problem to be German, other than in West Germany. In West Germany, being German meant accepting the burden of the Third Reich and the Holocaust and the Second World War. So West Germans often wanted to be Europeans. Those in Munich felt Mediterranean more than German. In Hamburg, they felt kind of British almost. So in West Germany, one didn't like to be German. In East Germany, that was not a problem, because they were the better Germany. The communists didn't have a burden from history. So the East Germans, with their unchallenged national feelings, joined West Germany, where national feelings were something at least difficult. Then the deepest, most profound opposition you could take was becoming a Nazi. My son, when he was 10 or so, he sent a balloon, as kids do. It made its way to East Germany, so he had a letter friend, pal friend. And we visited them in '87, and she admired the two Nazis among her fellow students, because they were the radical opposition against this fuzzy, in the GDR, from the SED to the churches, we can meet on a humanist heritage and all want the good, even though we think about many things profoundly differently. And the Nazis didn't buy any of this. They were just against it. So the daughter of Birgit, once she rebels against her father, the functionary, and is put by him into one of these educational prisons and gets out, joins the Skins.
Thank you.
There could be more, but...
That's okay. Nikki, I'm gonna ask you as well, because right-wing extremism in the Netherlands, you in your research you say it has a long history, but if you look at, does it spark from the NSDAP? Is Is it a completely different movement now?
I think what we've seen in the Netherlands, if we look at far-right extremism from 1945 on, it really, in the beginning, it had really strong ties with the occupations, and there were many far-right extremists or former NSB'ers who were really trying to get rid of their sentences, trying to get back into society, trying to, I don't know, get some recommendation for themselves that they also did some good stuff. And then you see in the 70s that the link with the Second World War and with the occupation, it's kind of like fading because there's a new generation of neo-Nazis popping up who are even more extreme than all the former NSB'ers. And then from the 80s on, it really becomes a strong anti-Islam movement. But I do agree with Mr. Schlink that nowadays, if you want to rebel against society, youth rebels go right. They used to go left, but nowadays youth rebels go right.
And why is that?
Well, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Well, so much of what was left has become mainstream.
Yeah.
So there's no good rebellious place
Yes.
on the left anymore.
Would you agree?
Yes, I do agree. Yeah.
And if you would look at the movement now, since the 70s and 80s, has it changed? Is it more diverse than it was?
I do believe so. I mean, if we look at it nowadays, for the Netherlands, you will see a strong anti-Islam protest movement, like Pegida and Dutch Defense League, the Dutch Identitarian movement. You will also see intellectual far-right extremism, like Study Society Erkenbrand, and you still see the neo-Nazis who are really clinging on to white pride and blood and honor. But the thing is, it's a very dynamic landscape. So they constantly interfere with each other. They all know each other. It's a network. They do stuff together. So when the identitarian movement climbs on top of a mosque, they do bring some neo-Nazis they knew from before. Why? Because they know the neo-Nazis show up and they're not afraid of being arrested. So it's it's not a very clear landscape. It's just a network of, and everyone is somehow related and has shared memories and shared experiences.
And is it a constant group or is it growing?
Well, I don't think that it's growing much in West Germany. They're the AfD, that's their party, that's kind of their marketplace. Around 10, 11, I think we have to live with this right-wing party. In the East, it's different. It's still growing. But it's as multifaceted as you described it for the Netherlands.
You write about the village that Sigroen lives. And it became, the way you describe it, it became really real for me. I could really envision it by your writing. And I was wondering, how did you find out about these villages and know so much details about it? Who did you speak with? Did you go there? What did you read?
Oh, there's stuff to read about them. A little bit of literature by them. There's literature by those who had left them. And I went there. I mean, I didn't get more than a casual conversation. I could talk to a teacher where the children go to school. But I was never really in it.
No.
They wouldn't allow a foreigner in.
It was one of the books that Sigroen reads is called The Truth About Anne Frank. The Truth About Anne Frank. It's a book that she... in the Dutch translation. Is that really a book? That's yeah, and you read it. What is in it?
It's by a person who had joined it or had grown up there and then got out.
Thank you.
Yes.
I think maybe this is a good moment to go to the second part because it describes also the village.
Het is een scène waar Bernhard Schlink beschrijft hoe zo'n feestje plaatsvindt in zo'n klein dorpje bij zo'n rechtse gemeenschap. Während der Rede hatten die Jungen und Mädchen im Rücken der Besucher in der Mitte der Wiese einen Holzstoß aufgerichtet. Die Fackelträger gingen durch eine Gasse, die die Besucher ließen, und entzündeten das Holz, während die Besucher auseinandergingen und einen Kreis um das Feuer bildeten. Als das Feuer aufloderte, spielte die Band zuerst die Melodie, dann stimmten alle ein. Flamme empor, steige mit loderndem Scheine. Casper kannte das Lied nicht, verstand aber alles, aber dass wir im geweihten Kreise stehen und die Flamme zu des Vaterlands Preis brennen sehen, dass die Flamme die Jugend zusammenruft und ihren Mut stärkt, dass ihr Zeichen die Feinde erbleichen lässt und dass wir an ihrem Altar schwören, Deutsche zu sein. Es ging weiter mit: Ein junges Volk steht auf und Brüder im Osten und Westen. Und wieder verstand Casper nur, dass wir junge Soldaten sind, ob Bürger, Bauer oder Arbeiter, dass wir marschieren und dass vor uns Europa leuchtet und in uns das Reich. Dann wurden die Lieder verhaltener, wehmütiger, trauriger, mit Der Wind weht über die Felder, zogen des Kaisers Reiter nach Flandern in den Tod. Und mit Gebt Raum, ihr Völker, die letzten Goten nach einem fernen Thule im grauen Meer. Casper kannte Wildgänse rauschen durch die Nacht von seiner Zeit in der evangelischen Jungenschaft, sang es mit und auch Am Brunnen vor dem Tore und Kein schöner Land in dieser Zeit. Lieder, die sich ihm eingeprägt hatten, als seine Großmutter sie mit ihm als Kind gesungen hatte. Er sah in die Runde. Im Feuerschein und während der letzten Lieder waren die Gesichter weich geworden. Wie sollte es anders sein, dachte er. Wie sollten Rechte nicht ebenso versonnen, verträumt und wehmütig sein können wie wir? Ihm fiel Generalgouverneur Hans Frank ein, der Schlächter von Polen, der auf der Burg in Krakau mit Gefühl Chopin gespielt hatte, und Hitler, der seinen Hund geliebt hatte. Casper wollte sich nicht in der Liederseligkeit mit allen, die mit ihm um das Feuer standen und sangen, eins fühlen. Er mochte Chopin und er mochte Hunde, wollte aber weder Frank Chopin spielen hören, noch mit Hitlers Hund spielen. Er stahl sich aus der Runde, ging zur Kirche und setzte sich vor dem Tor auf die Stufe. Es wurde weitergesungen, zum Schluss das Lied der Deutschen, mit allen 3 Strophen. Dann löste sich die Runde auf und ging nochmal an die Buden und an die Tische und die Band wurde fetziger und rockiger.
Thank you. Nikki, did you recognize the atmosphere described here?
Well, I don't think we have a scene like that in the Netherlands, but what you do see is the sense of belonging, also the sense of going back to nature, going back to your more natural role. So I do think that some of the persons I interviewed are striving for this, but we don't have a community like that in the Netherlands yet. But they do, what you do see is that for some it's really important to have these kinds of rituals, and they're very keen on it as well. And also sometimes they will travel to Germany to take part in it.
Mm-hmm. Because this is not the, it was a very turbulent time, of course, because not too long ago racist slogans were projected on the Erasmus Bridge in Rotterdam. And in Germany, the Rijksburger movement was planning a coup. And that's a very different, you also described that, I think, that more violent group in your book. But this is a very different image than I think a lot of people know from the extreme right group.
This village or where she grows up, das sind die Völkischen. that's one of these segments in this rich spectrum of right-wingers. And they look particularly for that. And also the youth organizations. There are several youth organizations on the right, and they give kids what kids don't get otherwise anymore. A fire and singing and a camp with tents, adventure. And that's one of their ways to recruit young people. And it's amazing how many academics send their kids into these camps because they think, oh, that's something I experienced when I was young 50 years ago, so my child should experience something like that. So it's particularly vivid among young people. But the Völkische, they are the most folksy among the right-wingers.
But you could maybe say, being the devil's advocate, that if they're in the village having these, volksspielen, it's and they're singing songs, making bonfires. That doesn't sound super harmful.
No, but if the neighbor is not the way they want him, they can burn down his barn. So it's this folksy way of being together. Doesn't mean that they are equally folksy and friendly.
They're inherently violent, you would say, yes.
I think that also for me in the beginning, when I started interviewing far-right extremists, in the beginning I was very much like, oh, okay, these people are very nice. I mean, everyone is entitled to their own opinion. Maybe we should also give them some space to have their own opinions. But my research lasted for 6 years, and in those 6 years, I really saw some persons shifting from non-violent extremism to violent extremism, and it had everything to do with you have the sense of belonging, but also you have the perceived group threat, you have the perceived enemy, and very, like you describe in the book, very dehumanizing language towards certain ethnic, religious minorities. And if you see, I mean, not all of them turn violent, but it is very harmful at the end of the day because it's so dehumanizing and it's really creating an environment that will lead to some going into violent extremism.
You cannot have it without that, do you think?
I haven't seen it yet, but I think it was, for example, it also really depends, I believe, on the circumstances, because I also interviewed many jihadists in 2012, and then I thought, okay, well, they want their Islamic State, but they live here in the Netherlands. What could possibly go wrong? And then a year later, that a lot of them traveled to Syria and Iraq, and then ISIS was established, and they joined ISIS, and some of them really did terrible things. So I also strongly believe that if you're in this environment with the perceived group threat, the perceived enemies, the dehumanizing language, that it is really something we should worry about. Doesn't mean that we all have to throw them in prison or overreact as a society or as a government, but you need to do something about it.
Looking at Sigrun in the end, she also turns to violence, you could say, a little bit, not her personally maybe, but she is with people who are violent. But in the book I read it as something she is doing, even though that is not necessarily what her parents want for her.
No, but that's the way you talked about too. You move between these segments. And die Völkischen, they are rather tame. Like many Pegida people are just citizens who walk with them. And if that's not enough, if you want to rebel more, then you join the black group that is in their outfit like the black from the left at one point were. And that's adventure and that's rebellion.
When you were writing about this, would it have been possible to describe this village if you hadn't been there in person? Do you have, as a writer, do you have to be there and do you have to see it? Or could you have known it from books?
Yes and no. I think we always research too much. I don't know, Köstler means something to some of you. He wrote the book Spartacus that was turned into a movie. And his memoir, he writes, he researched 1 year. What actually found its way in his book were the sandals. All the other thing was pretty much like he had imagined it anyway. And my last book before Olga is set in Deutsch Südwest, what's now Namibia. So I went there, actually when it was almost done, and it was good. But did I need it? It feels good. Mm-hmm. It feels good that you know, okay, it is more or less as I had imagined it.
Mm-hmm. And then Casper, the main character of the book, he really struggles with this granddaughter. She after his wife passes away, he makes an arrangement with her extreme right parents, and she can come to visit him every now and then in Berlin. So she comes, and then she says these things. She wants to visit all these very important Nazi places, and he takes her, but then she says things about it, and he's struggling. How do I deal with this? Do I counterspeak? Do I? And I was wondering as well, you, Nikki, when you read this, is this something you have struggled with?
Well, I was a researcher, so in the first place, it was for me to show who they were or who they are and what they believe and how did they get to these beliefs. But yeah, at some point I couldn't help myself with countering a little bit every now and then. But it wasn't really this strong debate going on that every now and then I would make a tiny remark or something. I once had this neo-Nazi who was really keen on establishing a Nazi state in the Netherlands. And at some point I also said to him, yeah, but dude, you can't even get out of bed in time in the morning. Like, why do you think that a national socialism is your thing? And then we laughed about it a little bit. So I would make comments like that. But if someone was completely denying the Holocaust, I didn't feel like it was my place to debate them. But I did always mention that I had other beliefs about this as well, because I didn't want them to feel tricked into it, that they would think that I was a like-minded person. So I always try to be honest and try to express my opinions about it.
And looking,
That's what he does too. He never says anything he doesn't believe.
No.
He doesn't always say what he believes. When he thinks it wouldn't lead anywhere. But he never says what he doesn't believe.
And do you think do you think that helps? Staying true to or saying yes, this is your belief and I believe something different. Is that the way we should deal with that? Do you have to stay in contact? And so I'm looking a bit for where's what works and also where's the boundary?
Well, I think the granddaughter is 15. And at 15 you are still open.
Yeah.
And he tries to open the world for her. I have a friend and colleague who at one point began to vote for the AfD. I have an American friend and colleague who voted for Trump. I mean, I stay in touch with them. We don't talk always about these issues, but every once in a while. At least the American friend didn't vote for Trump the second time.
Some progress there.
Maybe it helped that we all kept him in our community and didn't break with him. I mean, of course, there are cases when talking doesn't make any sense. I understood it. You know the story of the Pavlov dog?
No.
Well, a dog gets his food and a bell rings at the same moment. And then at one point, he starts with his saliva, even though there is no food. And you can deprogram the dog. It's a long process. Yeah. But if once food and the bell come together, it's as strong as it ever was.
Yeah, you're right about it. Yeah.
And it happened to me. I talked to someone from the right, and at 11:30 he says, well, maybe you have a point, I have to think about it. The next day, something triggers his right-wing attitude. Then the conversation was just for nothing.
Back at the start.
So sometimes talking helps, sometimes doesn't.
Yeah, in my research, I think over the 6 years, I think 5 or 6 interviewees left the far-right extremist movement. And all of them had a very... had an environment that still accepted them as a person. They weren't really acceptant to their beliefs, their far-right extremist beliefs, but they would always stay in touch and let them know, like, you can always come to me if there's something going on. And that's also why I think it's better also with the granddaughter. She's 15 in the books. You can't verbally attack a 15-year-old. It's much more important to stay in touch, to let them know you're there. They can come to you with questions, with doubts, that having doubts isn't scary. I think that's way more effective than just countering all the time and trying to basically brainwash them. You can't really force thoughts upon person.
And you open up something for her that she hadn't had before.
Yes.
What he tries with music. And he's lucky, she loves the piano.
She loves music, yeah. And Nikki, did you ever experience the opposite, so that, because you say a few of them left, but did they also try to tempt you to join them?
Definitely.
A lot, yeah.
Yes. Only the intellectual far-right extremists.
How did they do it?
Well, they were just trying to be really convincing. With the anti-Islam protesters and the little core of neo-Nazis, they were very accepting that I didn't have the same views. But then with the more intellectual, it's kind of more ethnic nationalists. They were really trying to convince me all the time, trying to debate me, trying to also criticizing me for not having enough children as well. But yeah, but you want a better future for your children, and we're going to have a civil war if we don't do something about the immigrants and think of the omvolking. And so they were very much more trying to get me into their camp. Yeah, for the other groups it was fine.
And well, you mentioned this about the mothers. I think it's interesting to speak about something that recently happened, of course, with the threats of Pim La Marsh.
Yes.
There was did you hear of this? Of the poet that was selected for the Children's Book Week in the Netherlands? There was a poet. He was the CPMB, which is the big organization that does all the coordination of the book sales. I think more or less the way to describe it. Sorry. It could be better. And they asked the poet to write a poem, like they do every year. And it's a writer called Pim La Marsh. And he wrote a book about a little lamb that is really a pig. And it's beautiful, but it's also, you could say it's about a lamb transitioning into a pig. So, and he wrote more books that also...
And also books for adults.
Adults, yeah. And there was one story about a boy being groomed by an older man. And there was a huge outcry. And I think it was sparked a lot by mothers who are fearing for their children because they say this man is a pedophile, which is complete nonsense, but it's a narrative that I think you see very, very strongly about protecting the children in these extreme groups. So, Nikki, how do you look upon that?
Well, it is something that keeps on coming back. At first, it's always like we have to protect the women against migrants and people with a migrant background. And then the next step is, because I also encountered it, we have to protect the children from the homosexuals. Because every homosexual is, according to some far-right extremists, a possible pedophile. And you see that narrative also constantly popping up nowadays. It wasn't as strong when I did my research, but I did see it every now and then. And yeah, and that's also why you see it, because the book about grooming the 12-year-old, it was a book for adults. And it was how confusing it can be, because the boy really liked his trainer and then he groomed him and he was really like, is he meaning well or not? And was really describing it as well. But it was seen as a pro-pedophile book. Yes.
But then this is a new ontwikkeling.
Well, they always complain that cancel culture is a left-wing thing. But so far, the right has been better at it, a lot.
But has this always been there? Because for me, this also sounds like something like, especially if you think about the whole Pizzagate thing going on in the United States. This for me, this feels as if, or I would think this would be something that is important, also imported from the United States. Or has this always been in the core of the movement?
I think it was there as well. I mean, especially if you look at what the Nazis did with homosexuals and transgenders and the LGBTQI+. I hope I have them all, people. But also as well that, for example, a couple of years ago, there was this transgender person reading kids' books in the libraries, and they stopped it because the Dutch identitarian movement started protesting against it, for example. And that's something that happened, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, and it got very little media attention. But you do see it popping up every now and then. And then the far-right extremist agenda, it's not only anti-migrants, it's also really diversity in all sorts of ways. No, they're really looking for an ethnic state with just white, straight people.
And is this? Do you recognize this from Germany?
The anti-diversity issue isn't that strong in Germany. The anti-migrants and anti-Muslims, that's strong, and particularly in East Germany, and understandably so. We had Turks in West Germany since 1970s, and they didn't have any foreigners. But it doesn't really go beyond that. I'm sure that they won't like them.
No.
But it's not on their public agenda, like obviously.
Yeah. And they really strive for a homogeneous state. So there's no room for people who are different, want to be different, choose to be different. And I think that has been the case for a long time.
The anti-immigrants, a few points. You describe how the grandfather, how Casper says to his granddaughter every time she brings up something negative about immigrants, and then he asks, like, how many of them does your father know then? How do you know? Have you ever met? And then there's all these composers, and some of them are Jewish. Because and I was wondering about the anti-immigrant sentiment in Eastern Germany, and if you could elaborate on that a bit, because it's less diverse in that sense than Western Germany.
Okay,
or is it not?
The reason I mentioned they didn't have foreigners in the GDR, so suddenly they come in, and in the first years, the jobs were harder to get than right now. So there was competition. And then I've heard it more than once. in the GDR there are all these prefabricated houses, Plattenbauten, as they are called. And since millions of East Germans moved west, many of them are empty. So imagine a little town of 30,000 people. They become assigned 2,000 migrants. What does the town do? They take 2 of these empty houses, restore them, and put the migrants in. But next door, there are Plattenbauten where the East Germans live and has never been restored. Of course, but one can't put them into unrestored houses. So there are many problems that are just bad situations, create bad problems. So that is a place, plays quite a role. And then, of course, there isn't enough money for social workers and for language courses, and so integration is very difficult.
Do you think we, well, as Western Europe maybe, were naive about the unification and what it would bring, in a sense, if you describe this?
I think nobody had even thought about it. Nobody had even thought about it. So there was no naive idea, there was just no idea. And then it came, and Kohl, that is certainly one of the great things he did, said, now it has to happen. I can't wait. Who knows what's happening next in Russia? So it came fast, couldn't be prepared well. So one muddled through and made many mistakes.
Before we go to the questions, I want to talk a bit about the future, because you already said they are still growing in Eastern Germany, and I think this, well, what happened with the death threats to Pim La Marsh also was something that, well, I hadn't seen in that way before. Leuzen, or well, things written on Anne Frank House, things written on Erasmusbrug. If you look at the future and the way, it's a big question, and the way this right-wing extremist groups will develop, what do you think? What is your fear? What is, yeah, how do you look at that?
Well, I think what we do clearly see is that they stopped protesting in large groups, that we haven't seen a large demonstration for a very, very long time. Mm-hmm. But what they are trying to do is to get their message more mainstream. And I think projecting it on the Erasmusbrug is one of it. One of the messages that was projected were the 14 words from very infamous American white supremacist David Lane, who got convicted for terrorist offenses. And even I had the NOS Dutch news on the phone. It's like, can you please explain to us why this is racist? And then I thought, okay, we have a really, really, really long way to go here. So what I do think is that they will try to focus for the next years on normalizing the far-right message, mm-hmm, and getting it more mainstream.
Can I ask one thing about this? Because I think that's very interesting, because that's a really lack, would you say it's a lack of knowledge that you see there? Or is it that they feel that, oh, it can't be that bad? Or is it more, yeah, we say polderen?
Both. I think when it comes to the Netherlands, you especially see it also as well in the literature around 2010. Almost everybody thought that far-right extremism was over. Mm-hmm. And I think we underestimated it, because at this moment it's like, oh, we see a really big rise in anti-Semitism. Well, has it returned, or did it never leave? Mm-hmm. So I think that's something we should focus on as well. And also because we don't see far-right extremist messages, we haven't seen them for a while that big in public space, it didn't mean that it wasn't there. And I think we underestimated it as well. And on the other hand, I think that the more the further we are from the 1945, we forget about what it entails, what it encompasses. And it's like, far-right extremism, that's like the Holocaust and stuff like that. But it's much broader belief. And I think people should educate themselves on it more as well. At least to know it, because you have to know it before you can counter it. But especially after I finished the PhD, I spent a lot of time explaining just what it entails and that it's bigger than just the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think, as you said, some of what they want becomes mainstream. They don't just want it to become. I mean, now we get fences and walls around Europe more and more. That was one of their demands. And anti-Semitism, one could often say, okay, there's a kind of anti-Israel position that is deep down anti-Semitic. Now Israel is changing in a way that I think this will become stronger. So it's a complicated landscape, and I think, as with migration, Europe will become movers somewhat to the right, and that may mean that those who now vote for AfD feel at home in the established parties again. I don't know. Maybe.
Maybe. I have one more question before we go to the hall for questions. And not to spoil everything, but if Sigrun, she reads a lot, and I feel in the book that the books and the stories and the music, the arts, are somewhat changing her views. Do you think art can do that?
Well, music doesn't make us better people. You read from Frank from the book in Krakow, who played Chopin. I think it's just a chance, like literature. It's a chance to know the world better, other people better, ourselves better. But you can read without doing any of that. So, same with music, it's just a chance to have a wider and better outlook at the world.
Thank you. Is there anyone who wants to? Yes, I already see a hand. There is someone coming towards you. And please wait for her till she is with you with a microphone, because there might be people watching from home. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your book. I liked it very much. I even fell in love with Sigrun. And I have one episode I want to connect to the boundaries you were talking about. Svenja is telling to Casper, you never fight to us. You don't know the feeling of a good victory. You are so weak. And sometimes I also feel so weak. Do you think we have to be stronger against the Ukraine, stronger to right people? Sigrun, she is fighting against a right-winger when the right-winger attacks Casper. Casper, he's sitting down and he's feeling very, very bad. Sigrun doesn't know she's fighting. Don't you think we have to fight more?
Well, there are certainly moments to fight. There are certainly moments to fight. And moments where we can't and shouldn't fight. And I don't know where Casper would have fought better with Sigrun. There, I think he could only do what he tried to do.
Thank you. Daar achterin is een vraag.
I can't
Yeah, thank you both. I would like to ask a question to Nikki, tapping into what you said before, that yeah, you think it's not like the right thing to throw them into prison. But I was wondering, like, what's the thing that you think, like, how should we deal with this? If you have any ideas on that.
Well, what really struck me when I was doing the research was that basically all the persons I interviewed, they all had a very accepting environment. So nobody ever opposed them. No one ever said them on a daily basis, like, okay, but what you're saying right now is really dehumanizing. So also when it came to the family, they were very acceptant of it, or they just didn't talk about politics at home, or they just were very reluctant to speak about it. When it came to employers, they all thought, okay, everyone is entitled to their private life and their own opinions. And that created an environment for them that no one ever held them accountable for the things they spoke about. And I think it's very important as a society, like, we don't have to push all of them into a social isolation, but we should be much, as the silent majority, we should be much louder in this debate, because the far-right fringe is really hijacking the debate at the moment. And I think that's, for example, where we should really start. Also as well, for example, in the House of Parliament. I know it's really difficult. I know everyone has 4 minutes to speak and 3 interruptions. But sometimes you just have to speak up. And for years, I didn't really see that happening. That happened the past year. It's very recent now. But I think that's a good start. And also, as a society, we should find our moral compass back. We should really get some agreement on what you can say and what is really problematic if you say it. And also hold people accountable for what they are saying, and also ask them. Because, for example, I had some interviewees who said, yeah, I want this white ethnic state. And then I said, okay, but how are you going to do that? Like, are you going to sterilize people? Are you going to, I don't know, deport them to other countries? Are you going to exterminate them? Like, what do you want to do at some point? And that's only when they started realizing how dangerous it just is if you just said, yeah, I want this white ethnic state. So I really think we shouldn't be afraid of just talking to people with extremist views, and we also shouldn't be that afraid of opposing them in a very connecting way as well. Like, I don't judge you as a person, but the things you're saying, I think they're really problematic. For example, the other day, I got into this LinkedIn discussion on Andrew Tate, and I already felt sorry when I started it. But it was someone who said, yeah, my sons are watching videos of Andrew Tate and the media are only paying attention to his very extremist views, his most extremist views. And then I said, yeah, but we can still agree on the fact that his most extremist views are very problematic, right? And then, well, everyone got completely upset about it, and that, no, we should all really try to understand it. And I think that's also something that we need to be more aware of, that we need to talk. We need to keep on talking, even though it's difficult, even though also in my own environment, and then someone is suddenly not believing, someone thinks COVID-19 is a hoax, and I'm really tired, and I think, okay, not now, we're at a party, but still we have the responsibility to do something about it. So sorry for this very long answer, but I think that would be a first step.
Thanks a lot, and it's nice how you also give some responsibility to the audience, so thanks.
Thank you. Maybe your last
I would like to add something to your remark. I remember the situation on the New York subway. I was with a woman, and further down, a big guy was molesting a young woman. So I thought, okay, I have to confront him. Probably he'll beat me down, but that's what I have to do. And the woman said, oh, wait a moment. And she approached him and said, I think you don't realize how strong you are. and how much you intimidate this woman with your strength. I'm sure you don't want that. That worked.
Wow.
Well, I would have probably been knocked down. So the strength has many shapes.
Thank you. I think we're gonna close off. If there's one really okay, yes. One, and that's then the final question.
I've got a question for Herrn Schlink. Do you think the right-wing people would read your book? And if so, what do you think their reaction will be?
I just don't know. There's a weekly in Germany, Junge Freiheit. That's a right-wing kind of, with some intellectual ambition. And they sometimes reviewed a book of mine. But they always reviewed it critically. They didn't review this one, so don't know.
Nikki Sterkenburg, Mr. Bernhard Schlink, thank you both very much for being here. Thank you for coming to this evening tonight. Please, if you haven't done it yet, read the book because it is really beautiful.
There are signed copies outside.
There are signed copies outside for sale. So please, I would really recommend that. Thank you both, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you.